Welcome to another edition of my show of shows. This time I'm going to talk to you a little bit about communications when I was a kid back in the 1960s. You know, I don't want to sound a lot like my parents did when I was a kid because they were always telling me about their childhood memories. And now in retrospect, I'm glad they did because it was kind of interesting to see what the world was at when they were kids, and how it advanced in their eyes to when I was a kid, and how it's advanced now to the world that I grew up in, looking and seeming almost archaic. In the mid to late 1960s, television looked great to my folks who grew up on radio. Heck, we could get 3 channels on our TV, and if the weather was just right, we could sometimes get a fourth UHF channel. Our neighbors, the Brennans, had a big wire antenna on their roof to pull TV signals in better. There was one on our roof too, but I don't remember it ever being connected to the TV. We used what we called rabbit ear antennas, and they sat on top of the TV. Funny story about the Brennan's antenna, though. There happened in the late spring of 1966 that there was a real large UFO flap in Michigan, and my dad, after a long day's work, would relax in the backyard with several bottles of beer. Sometimes, like on this particular night, Mom would join him, and on this night, the Brennans also joined him. As I was saying, in the spring of 1966, there was a really big UFO flap in Michigan. There were news stories every night about the UFOs, and back then, for some reason, they scared the hell out of me. But it was not just making local news, it was on the national news reports nightly too. So while Dad and Mom and the neighbors were relaxing in the backyard, it was well after dark, so I stayed in the house. Even though the thought of flying saucers scared me, I loved watching science fiction and horror stories at that time. And that night, I recall I was trying to tune in a channel that carried The Outer Limits, which was frequently about aliens. Well, I heard the voice was getting louder from the backyard. I heard Uncle Chuck. He wasn't really related, but that's what I called him, Uncle Chuck and Aunt May. And anyways, I heard him say, "Look up over there over our house, Mabel. What is that thing?" And I heard my dad say in response, I've never seen anything like it in the sky. My stomach went numb. I was sure they were having UFO sighting right there in our own backyard on Shreve Drive in Bridgeport, Michigan. The questions flooded over me. Where are they from? And what do they want? I was afraid for Dad and Mom out there, but I was glad I was inside. After a few minutes, I heard Uncle Chuck and Dad and the rest begin to laugh loudly. I wondered if they were crazy, but they weren't. It turned out what they saw was the Brennan's antenna wires reflecting street and car lights, and the warm breeze that night caused the antenna to sway slightly, giving it the illusion of motion. After that, Dad thought if he could be deceived so easily, so were all the other people who had been having sightings in Michigan, and for him that explained it all. But it didn't. Those other sightings were so weird that the U.S. Air Force sent Dr. J. Allen Hynek here to Michigan to investigate the sightings and to come up with an answer that would calm people's fears. And most people who study UFOs today will remember that Hynek had concluded that what people were seeing was possibly swamp gas. And as I said in the beginning, we could receive 3 channels pretty well, WNEM in Saginaw, which was then an NBC affiliate, now CBS, WJRT, which is ABC, and I can't remember the other. News is now almost instant, but not so back then. The local stations aired a half-hour news program at 6 o'clock. Then the networks aired a half-hour of national and world news at 6:30 to 7, and that was it. News was really quite limited. Of course, we also had the Saginaw News, which came out daily back then, and a small local paper that began in 1969, the Bridgeport Future, which I wrote for, and I'll tell you more about that in another installment. The biggest change I've seen on local news is how the weather is presented. Chuck Waters and Jim Payton did the local weather on WNEM. There was no on-air radar like there's today, no Doppler. The national map had warm and cold fronts drawn on, and the state map basically just had temperatures. The state map came most into use for weather warnings. The area of watches and warnings were drawn on, and those crawls, which we see across the bottom of the screen now during so that programming doesn't actually have to be interrupted, were not invented yet then. The biggest news story I remember when I was growing up, though, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also the Kennedy Assassination, and then John Glenn orbiting the Earth, and of course the moon landing. The Cuban Missile Crisis had Dad and Mom very upset, but they waited till us kids were in bed to discuss it. But I still got the drift of it, and it scared me that my parents were so worried about it. They really believed that the Soviet Union was about to launch a nuclear attack on us. Dad thought Saginaw, due to its many manufacturing facilities, would be targeted, as well as Midland with its Dow chemical plant. The crisis really did not last all that long, but Dad was ready to ship us kids and Mom up north to Lincoln, about a 2.5 hour drive from Saginaw, to stay with my Uncle Nick and Aunt Helen on their farm, where we would presumably be safe. Death would be instant in Saginaw and Midland area, and in Lincoln we could presumably die slower of radiation poisoning, but I'm sure that didn't cross anybody's mind at that time. Before that happened, President Kennedy resolved the problems and the missiles were removed, and the United States was once again a safe place to live, a free land. But wow, during that time, the tension was so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. In the 1960s, we as a nation had great pride in the space program, and in one decade we went from John Glenn orbiting in the Earth in the Friendship 7 to landing man on the moon. The graphics on TV in the early 1960s were so crude and John Glenn's orbits were shown on an illustration of Earth with his path marked in little slashes or dashes. Everyone was excited that day. I rarely remember my mom praying when I was a kid. It just wasn't that important to her, unfortunately. But she did that day for John Glenn's safety. When President Kennedy was shot, I was homesick from school. I remember that black and white TV announcement, special news bulletin, and right away one of the greatest national tragedies of my young life was brought into our living rooms. Photos were not broadcast right away because that took time, but a sober-faced newscaster broke into the program to give the news. And instead of being able to cut away to on-the-scene images, he was actually talking on the phone to a reporter there in Dallas as the events were unfolding. I remember Mom turned white, all color drained from her face as she sunk into my dad's recliner and began to sob. It seemed as if our nation came to a standstill until shortly after the president's burial. For anyone who lived through that time, the scenes of his assassination, lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and burial will forever be a part of our consciousness. Of course, there were other assassinations in that decade, Martin Luther King Jr., and then yet another Kennedy, Robert. But these did not impact our nation as deeply, but they still led to shock that it could happen in our nation. When man first landed on the moon and walked on its surface, the entire world watched on in awe. In our house on Shreve Drive, my brother Frank, his wife Jean, Dad, Mom, Bill, Roseanne, and I were glued in front of the television set as the first step onto the moon was made. But even back then, there were conspiracy theories. And I remember many people fearing that when the lunar lander was opened, the change in the moon's atmosphere would set off explosions which would devastate the moon and play havoc, of course, here on Earth. The conspiracy nuts were wrong then, just as they are usually wrong nowadays. But in my 6 decades, I have survived so many end-of-the-world theories that they don't even deserve my consideration any longer. But in a future episode, I want to go into some of those with you, because it's kind of interesting, really. There were many TV shows of the 60s which are even now favorites of mine. Topping the list for me would be Dark Shadows. Very few kids did not watch that show that became a cult classic, and Barnabas Collins became an American icon in the portrayal by Jonathan Pryde. The Invaders, starring Roy Finnis, was another one about being a subtle alien invasion, and it scared me, but still I loved watching it. Staples were, of course, The Addams Family, Gilligan's Island, The Wonderful World of Disney, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, and The Munsters. The local television repairman was always in demand, and the best known in the Saginaw area was Gasix. They are still in business today, and I remember well the TV repairman who would come to the house to work his magic, and it rarely looked like magic and it really did look like magic, I should say, as he opened up the back of the set where so many glass tubes glowed, and in the case he always brought was a tube tester and a wide array of glass tubes for replacement. Very seldom did the repairman have to take the television to his shop for repair, but when he did, there was always a loaner, so we would miss out on nothing. Very few homes in our neighborhood had two TV sets because they were still quite costly, and most just had one. It was sort of a status symbol to make people think you were wealthy if you had more than one, at least in my area. And the same was true of telephones. While we lived on Shreve Drive, we were on a party line. A private line was not available where we were. It came about later, of course. There was always someone listening in and there was always somebody listening in and somebody who would hog the phone for hours when you needed to make what you thought was an important call. And if you had two phones, you were considered well-to-do, as it cost quite a bit to have an extra line in your home. Dad and Mom always spoiled my sister Roseanne. Money was always tight, but for a brief few months, not long before she got married, she had a Blue Princess phone in her bedroom with her own phone number. As tight as money always was, her phone only lasted a few months, but she had it nonetheless, a symbol of prosperity and of being popular to her. Money would not have been as tight as it had been had Dad not loved his beer and cigarettes so much. He was never mean to us, but those two commodities meant more to him than our futures. Not a dime was set aside to further our educations, and it was much more than just an after-work beer for him. Every Friday night when we went shopping at Ray's Food Fair, the Dixie in Saginaw, he'd buy a full case. But that wasn't enough. After work every night, he stopped off for 2 or 3 beers with his buddies. Add that to the additional 6-pack every few nights, and you can understand why money was so very tight. He had his beer and Camel cigarettes, yet many bills were left unpaid. I remember many a time when a bill collector would come to the door and Mom would run and hide in the bathroom while one of us kids lied for her, saying that she wasn't home and we didn't know when she'd be back. This is sort of off topic, but I remember a number of times that she would lock herself in the bathroom with her bottle of blue and white diet pills, illegal speed, really, prescribed by Dr. Shaheen, while threatening to kill herself if we kids didn't behave. The thing is, we were fairly well-behaved kids, so I didn't know what she really expected from us. I'm not exaggerating when I say she was very manipulative and very, very overpowering and controlling when it came to me. My dad stayed pretty much out of my life and let her do her best to ruin it, and she did for a long time. But he didn't care. He had his 2 other sons, Frank, the oldest, and Bill. Frank was one of the kids that never did any wrong in my parents' eyes. He was perfect. And Bill, well, his relationship with Dad and Mom was just plain weird. Most times the 3 fought like cats and dogs, and Bill was shipped off most weekends to our grandparents' house. There was even talk at one time of letting them keep him, and there were many times that I wished they had of. While Frank was sickening because of his perfection, Bill was hard to cope because he truly hated me, and he got into drugs really, really deeply in the late 60s when they became so popular. Again, I got off topic, and I apologize for that. And I guess that's about it for this time. But next time around, I'd like to share with you some more of my memories of my school days, and because for me they were quite traumatic years, thanks in large part to my mother. But in retrospect, they were also pretty interesting years. So thanks for stopping by and taking a listen with me. Hope to have you back soon.